This review of the ASUS ROG Ally is going to be dense. We'll be going through gaming performance, battery life, noise, frequency spectrum in the GN hemianechoic chamber, thermals, discussion of the SD card situation, and how actually great it is to take the Ally apart. We're very excited about doing this review, and it's been fun to work on because we got to work with a bunch of different handheld devices, but there's also a lot of complexity to them. So there's a mixture of things that we really liked, like the assembly, and things that we didn't like the MicroSD card reader breaking. We compared the Ally against the Steam Deck, the Nintendo Switch, and some older Aya Neo devices. We're also working on some competing handhelds next. And all that means this review will be long. We're coming in late to the review cycle here because we waited to buy this unit. We were on a wait list for it, pre-ordered it, and we got it in, and we decided to just throw everything in here. So we expect that many of you will jump around the review, and that's totally fine. We've timestamped things below, so you can do that. They're mostly containerized sections. Some kind of rely on others. But for the most part, they're standalone. And we're mixing things like objective analysis of the FPS, the battery life, things like that, and some subjective discussion of the hardware, as in physical feel of the device, and software, alongside some shared thoughts from both Patrick and I on the teardown process. So we've got a bit of everything in here. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our brand new 15-year anniversary edition large anti-static mod mat for PC building. The GN15 large mod mat features 4 grounding snap points, 1 at each corner to make it easy to move around your work area for PC builds. Plus it has a ton of new diagrams and useful pinout information. The mat is designed to not only protect your table and your parts from dings and scratches during the build, but also provide useful information on common front panel connector wiring, standard fan orientation, pinouts, and it offers functionality with screw tracking grids and sorters so that you can more easily reassemble components. This highly durable surface is also great for working with heat guns, like for tube bending and for water cooling projects. The mat is already available and it's shipping now on store.gamersnexus.net, and it's the best way to help us fund this type of ultra deep dive review content so that we can produce more of it. Thanks for your support, and grab a mod mat today on store.gamersnexus.net. The ASUS ROG Ally had a weird start to life because it began as an April Fool's joke that wasn't funny enough to be fake. And actually it's 2 handhelds. There's 2 Allies. One has a Ryzen Z1 Extreme processor, basically an R7 7840U at $700, and the other Ally is a cut-down Ryzen Z1, which will be $600. Both of these are called the ROG Ally RC71L, and both come with Zen 4 plus RDNA 3 APUs. But one has 8 cores and 16 threads with 12 CUs, while the other has 6 cores and 12 threads with 4 CUs. The $700 Z1 Extreme has a chance at being the handheld price-to-performance leader between competitors like the top-of-the-line GPD Win 4 and the Aya Neo Quinn on one end, and the relatively inexpensive Steam Deck on the other. However, there have been some widely reported problems with the Ally since its launch. First, with performance degradation from a forced BIOS update, and then a flood of broken microSD cards. We'll talk about all that as well, but let's start with some hardware impressions. Starting with what's included. The Ally's packaging is pretty simple, especially for an ROG product. The Ally comes with a power adapter, a cheap, small cardboard stand, and that's it. Based on our experience with other handheld PCs, a docking station with USB Ethernet display out and a carrying case are necessary accessories. The Ally's 1080p 120Hz FreeSync screen is a major selling point on paper, but we have mixed practical feelings about it. On the positive side, 1080p is still the most common gaming resolution, whereas the Steam Deck's 1280 by 800 screen, which is actually rotated, requires letterboxing or stretching in some games. The Ally's screen displays brighter colors out of the box than the 512GB Steam Deck, meaning the Steam Deck can appear washed out in comparison. On the other hand, it can be difficult to take advantage of the Ally's high refresh rate, since a lot of AAA games will struggle to run on this device above 60 FPS at 1080p. But the extra pixels versus the deck do help with other smaller details, like text legibility. An Extreme mobile unit with a laptop 3080, not a real 3080, costs $1,500 from Best Buy. That's insane. While ASUS is selling a laptop 4090, which is definitely not a real 4090, for $2,000. We have nothing against eGPUs, but the proprietary standard is awful. And the price isn't great either. ROG's Flow connector is annoyingly close to the non-proprietary OcuLink, currently used by GPD's G1 eGPU, and there's not a great reason to not use a standard. The Ally is slightly smaller than a Steam Deck on paper. It's 28 centimeters for the Ally versus 29.8 for the Deck, and the Ally has slimmer grips. In practice, the Ally takes up basically the same amount of space in a bag or in your lap. A more significant factor, though, is the Ally's weight. It's 608 grams to the Deck's 669 grams, plus or minus some error, anyway. Matte white may be a bad long-term choice for a device that's meant to be touched constantly, but it looks great out of the box, especially with the RGB lighting around both the joysticks. The Deck's controls are pretty different. The Ally, on the other hand, sticks to a 100% Xbox Series X layout, including the joystick positions and the round D-pad. The Ally is more familiar, while the Deck's twin touchpads give it more versatility. Actual feel is highly subjective. It's hard for us to comment on that meaningfully in a way that helps you. Patrick thinks that the Valve's oversized grips make the Deck more comfortable, but he thinks the Ally's rear buttons are easier to use. I personally find that the Ally's rear buttons are more difficult to use, and while the Decks are easier for me, I don't think they're good enough to be treated as a standard. So in other words, two people have different opinions on a subjective matter. Go figure. We really wish the Ally included more than one built-in USB port, which would give it a big boost over the Deck. We're tired of single-port devices here. There's space for more. We're also disappointed that ASUS limited SSD compatibility to 2230 drives. This was a huge opportunity to beat the Deck. 2230 drives are more expensive per gigabyte than 2280 drives, and their smaller physical size limits their capacity in most cases. Starting with the first thing we noticed, ASUS has gotten far too comfortable forcing automatic BIOS updates. Updates aren't inherently bad, and they often add security, but forcing them without a warning is bad, and so is shoving out a bunch of half-baked hotfixes in rapid succession, which they did. As soon as we connected our Ally to the internet, Windows Update immediately downloaded and flashed a BIOS update. 2 days later, the My ASUS app forced another BIOS update in the background without any input from us. In fact, it didn't even tell us that it was a BIOS update. It just told us to save our files and buckle up. For some reason, My ASUS is separate from Armoury Crate, another software hub responsible for yet another set of software and firmware updates, and the one that's used as the default front end for the Ally. The second BIOS update that My ASUS forced was version 319, a version which has known performance issues and which ASUS had specifically advised against installing nearly a week prior to forcing it on us. ASUS said, quote, "Some users are reporting lowered performance on the latest BIOS 319. If you want to hold off on that BIOS update, you can. Thanks for the clear language. Apparently, we can't, ASUS. We opened My ASUS to disable automatic updates, but we found that it's impossible to control or interact with the app at all without creating an account and logging in, even as it actively installs updates. In contrast to My ASUS, Armoury Crate almost looks good. It's still disgusting that ASUS and Gigabyte and maybe MSI now injects bloatware into Windows via motherboard firmware, but at least it has a purpose on the Ally. The Armoury Crate overlay works similarly to the Steam Decks, but with customizable shortcuts for things like power plans, FPS limiters, and Radeon Super Resolution. The biggest strike against it is that almost all of its functions, other than LED control, are just shortcuts for controls that already exist elsewhere. Also, having not one but two physical buttons on the Ally bound to both opening Armoury Crate gives us a bad feeling, like the OEM-specific buttons on old keyboards. The Windows 11 Touch keyboard makes a massive difference for Windows on touchscreen devices, and this is actually one of the stronger points of having Windows on a device like this. We've come a long way since the Aya Neo founder shipped with a physical button to bring up the on-screen keyboard. The Windows 11 Touch keyboard, different from the Windows on-screen keyboard, behaves exactly like a touchscreen phone. It appears whenever a text field is selected. We also can't overstate how much easier this makes it to control Windows on a handheld. It's completely possible to use the Ally without peripherals, maybe more so than with desktop mode on SteamOS. ASUS has also predefined some macros for things like taking screenshots and opening Task Manager. That's on top of the most obvious Windows advantage, which is that the apps these handhelds are meant to run are often native to Windows, not Linux. Of course, Windows can be installed on a Steam Deck, and SteamOS can, unofficially, be installed on an ROG Ally, but the out-of-the-box experience is more beginner-friendly on the Ally. Windows defaults to running at 1920 by 1080 with 150% scaling on the Ally, which is cramped on a screen this size. You can change it though. 720p and 1080p are the only display modes supported without enabling VSR or connecting an external display. So these are the only full-screen resolutions that games offer on the Ally. We're now moving to our hemi-anechoic chamber, and projecting in here is always very strange because of how quiet it is. But we have a separate video talking about how we built it, We have a news video talking about why we built it at a basic level. And then our Fractal Terra ITX review was the first product that we actually used the chamber on. And that video contains a lot of background on what we do with it and what the numbers mean. So we won't be going into as much of that background information in this video, but we'll link all those below in case you really care about why and how it works. So although we have data for each of these devices under idle conditions, low load conditions, and full load conditions, we're only going to focus on presenting the full load conditions with different power states. So that'd be like turbo, performance, plugged in, not plugged in, things like that. And the reason we're not bothering with idle states for the most part anyway, we have some basic numbers in there, but is because the devices are already so quiet that it kind of becomes irrelevant. But it's the load where the fans have a lot of chance to differentiate themselves in frequency. We might have a higher pitched approach versus a lower pitched approach between devices. For numbers, we're going to present frequency spectrum, and then we're also presenting the dBA SPLs, just the noise level, so to speak. And additionally, we have some noise samples for you. So we'll start with those. So before we go to the objective plots, here's a couple noise samples to get you accustomed to the sound. We're boosting these by the same amount in each file and post so you can hear them more clearly, but we'll have unboosted numbers for the analysis. Here's a sample of the Ally and its loudest scenario that's plugged in and with turbo mode. In this clip, you can hear a generally higher tone from the fan. Here's another sample of the Ally in a more common unplugged scenario with performance mode. It's much quieter overall, and the frequency is also lower. Unlike the Ally, the Steam Deck caps its frame rate and disallows tearing at a system level by default. Here's a sample of the Steam Deck in its loudest condition, uncapped with tearing allowed, so full frame rate and unplugged. That's at a typical position in the Steam Deck's fan ramp cycle, but it has a couple of those. So this is the same test, but with the RPM in a higher part of its fan ramp cycle. In that clip, you can hear that it ramps, purges the heat, and then slows back down. And here's one of the Steam Deck with a 60 FPS cap and no tearing. And finally, here's a sample of the Nintendo Switch. You won't hear much. What we can hear is a little bit of a higher frequency, but the total noise is very low. It's close to the noise floor that we had for testing. Okay, now we have a foundation for the frequency analysis. This chart is going to get kind of crazy. First, some updates. We've truncated the frequency start to 20 Hz this time. We've also changed the major grid line stepping, or the white lines, to increment in steps of 10 dB. This is because a 10 dB jump is widely regarded as effectively doubling in perceived volume to the human ear. Finally, we reduced the vertical scale from -75 last time to -40. These improvements to the chart legibility came from viewers of our Terra review. If you have further suggestions on this and you have some background with this kind of data, we'd love to hear from you as we're making improvements to the presentation of each test. Final background info here, this chart is a snapshot of a set of data across a moment in time, with the frequency on the bottom and the SPL dBRMS on the left axis. The data is representative of a common steady-state fan behavior for each device. We do have some extra notes on the Steam Deck though. You heard it was more variable than the others. Okay, let's get past the blank chart. The Ally starts us off. It's plugged in and set to turbo, so it's the loudest possible condition. We noticed the device was overall subjectively loud, particularly at the more annoying higher frequencies when compared to the other devices. We can see this manifest particularly in the 2000 to 5000 Hz range, with a steep fall off as we approach 6000 Hz. Speaking with Aris from Cybernetics and Hardware Busters, one of our peer reviewers for acoustic data, he believes the following of frequencies for humans. Quote, 2 to 5 kHz is the most important frequency zone for us humans. Our ears are most sensitive there. This doesn't mean that lower bands can't be annoying. Also, depending on age, frequencies above 15 to 16 kHz don't play a role, especially if you're over 30. Now, this quote from Aris should help give us some perspective. Note that noise is, of course, highly subjective, so although his beliefs regarding the most sensitive range are commonly agreed with, including by us, each person may have some differences. Our other peer reviewer for this content was Mike Chin, founder of Silent PC Review and an acoustic consultant today. He had this context to add for our viewers. The 3 to 5 kHz region is where tonal sounds bother us the most. A primary reason often cited is that this is the range where baby crying falls, but we generally hear the entire middle range, say 120 Hz to 5 kHz, very well. and can be sensitive to any tonalities in that region. Think of the frequency range of a standard 88-key piano. The lowest note, fundamental, is 27.5 Hz. The highest is 4186 Hz. Middle C, or C5, is 261.63. Imagine middle C held down continuously on an organ, even at low volume. It wouldn't take long for you to get bothered by it, and that's just 261.63 Hz. And again, that quote is from Mike Chin, who contributed significantly to the fundamentals of silent PC component testing and has been helping peer review all of our acoustic content so far. But the Ally isn't normally plugged in if it's handheld, so let's go to unplugged and performance mode. This is the more common use case. In this mode, the Ally drops significantly in overall volume, which we'll get to. It also has a softer falloff in frequency towards the upper end. We no longer have the elevated power in the 3000 to 5000 Hz range, and the tone more gradually softens above that. Adding silent mode, we instantly see that it definitely does what its name says by reducing the volume. The entire spectrum is shortened following the reduction in total dBA. But particularly we see a reduction in the 2500 to 3800 Hz range. Adding the Steam Deck with VSync on, we see a noise level that most closely follows the silent mode Ally, except for a deviation in the 1400 to 2000 Hz range. Keep in mind that the Steam Deck has two fan suppliers, but we plotted their differences previously. Ours here is the Hawaiian fan. Disabling VSync allows the Steam Deck to get much hotter in this workload from uncapped frame rate, drastically increasing the noise levels overall, but especially in the 1200 to 2000 Hz range, and then again in the 3500 to 4000 Hz range. The point it falls is similar to the turbo and plugged-in Ally. And disabling VSync also causes a lot more fan ramp and deramp, which is generally more observable from the change, but not reflected here since this is only a moment in time. We noticed it was typically 2 to 4 dBA change between fan speeds during the course of gaming. This segment was one of the louder ones. Finally, completing our chaotic chart is the switch, similar to the silent Ally and VSync Steam Deck, with the noteworthy difference that it's also quieter at the lower end of the frequency spectrum. Enough of that, those sections will get shorter as we get more experience presenting them, but for now we're still learning how to present that data. Let's move to a simpler chart, noise levels. This shows the total volume, so to speak, in dBA and under certain conditions. All tests are at 20 inches. The noise floor was about 13.6 dBA across all tests. Our chamber can be as low as 11 dBA or as high as 14, but it was 13.6 here. The switch was quiet enough to be difficult to measure. It was effectively at the noise floor from a front-on perspective of the user or the microphone. The Steam Deck with VSync on in its lower part of the ramp cycle was around 15.4 dBA and the next quietest device. Next is the Ally in silent mode at 16.4 dBA, so about the same volume as the prior Steam Deck entry, but slightly noticeably louder than the switch. The higher end of the fan ramp cycle on the Steam Deck brought us to 19.7 with VSync on, a noticeable increase in volume. Valve could tune its fan curve for a less observable change here. VSync off was loud and has 3 entries we'll highlight, 24.1 dBA at the low end of the ramp, 28.2 typically, so that's what you'd normally hear, and 32.1 dBA during a bursted high ramp cycle, which is loud. The Ally maxed out at 26.8 dBA, which is similar to the Deck during its typical cycle with VSync off. Now we'll talk about the disassembly process. We didn't take this apart until after we completely finalized testing in all charts, including stuff after this. I first took it apart to wire up some thermocouples, and then later Patrick took it apart to investigate the SD card reader integrated circuit, basically, to try and look for signs of failure. So let's go to Patrick first for the thoughts of just the assembly itself.
Steve has torn down the Ally a little bit, and I've torn it down a little bit further. I was hunting for the SD card controller, but I think both of us have been pretty impressed by how easy it was to take the Ally apart and how maintainable it is in general. So I'm just going to walk through starting from the outside. There's only 6 screws holding in the back shell here. And then once you have taken those screws out, it just pops off. The Steam Deck shell is very difficult to pry apart. The Ally, not so much. The thumbsticks and the battery, I think, are the most likely candidates for replacement, and those can be taken out without removing other pieces. Heatsink can be left on the motherboard. You know, you could take out the motherboard as a full unit with the heatsink and fans on it. I've taken the heatsink off here, but these fans should be pretty easily replaceable as well. You know, you could just undo these cables and then they're just taped on here and screwed in. I think overall, this is a pretty modular unit. The back shell and the internal parts, all of the ones that I removed, there's only 3 different types of screws among them. One of them is specifically for the speakers. There are no tamper screws on the outside of the unit, and there are no hidden screws. Yes, there are anti-tamper stickers, but they're not going to stop you from opening up the unit, and they're not going to stop you from, I think, replacing the SSD or some of the other obvious candidates for cleaning and maintenance, like the thumbsticks. Because this is a mobile all-in-one unit, you know, in terms of upgrading, really, you're just going to swap out the SSD, and there's not a whole lot else to do here. But overall, I'd say this is a pretty good effort by ASUS. I had some issues with the software, but on the hardware side, very, very maintainable.
Back to me for benchmarking methodology and setup. So we're covering a ton in this review. These tests are just a representative sample. We're comparing the ROG Ally, again, the top-of-the-line $700 model, against the 512 gigabyte Steam Deck, as well as 2 older Aya Neo devices. That's the Next and the Founder, and we're adding some more devices to this in the near future. When benchmarking individual components, for especially frame rate, we download the latest available drivers, and for the Ally, we did one different thing, which is we replicated a typical user experience. That means applying updates through Windows Update, My ASUS, and Armory Crate, rather than manually hunting down the drivers. We then paused the updates for the duration of testing. This is the experience that ASUS largely steers its users towards, because they want people to treat it like a handheld console rather than a gaming PC. So we followed that direction as end users, and we did it that way. For other controls, FreeSync was disabled on the Ally, and unless otherwise noted, VSync was disabled and tearing allowed on the Steam Deck. We use the term VSync out of convenience, but VSync isn't technically accurate on the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck's panel is actually portrait mode, and so the screen refreshes move side to side with vertical tearing. We also experienced some bugs around tearing and frame rate caps on the deck, which we discussed with Valve, and we came away with some interesting information. Firstly, even if you want VSync, which is valuable mostly for battery life preservation purposes, if not tearing, there's no real reason to enable it in-game on the deck, according to Valve here. Quote, by default, GameScope always synchronizes output frames to the physical display, unless that allow tearing option is checked. It enables immediate flips in the kernel driver. We also had issues with the OS level 60 Hz cap being applied on boot without being shown in the UI, but we were eventually able to gather a full set of uncapped tearing-enabled deck results. And if you want to learn more about all of this, actually GameScope and many other elements of the SteamOS are open source and fully available on GitHub. First, some important background about how TDP numbers are often not representative of real power consumption. The Ally has 3 operating modes. They are Windows power plans. They're Silent, Performance, and Turbo. It defaults to Performance on battery and Turbo when plugged in, or a mode can be selected manually through Armory Crate. ASUS describes Silent as 10 watts, Performance as 15 watts, and Turbo as 25 watts on battery and 30 watts on wall power. As usual though, TDP numbers should be ignored in favor of observable measurements. TDP is often not fully representative of real power consumption, but it depends on how the company calculates TDP. Some are closer than others. TDP also changes between CPUs, so the older AMD formula doesn't necessarily apply to all of their CPUs. Under load, a plugged-in Ally with a full battery, 30-watt TDP, can easily draw the full 65 watts that the AC adapter is capable of delivering, while the Steam Deck, a 15-watt TDP, pulls 30 watts under the same conditions. Without confirmation of actual power draw, it is inappropriate to assume ASUS's 15 watts is the same as Valve's 15 watts. So 15 watts does not necessarily equal 15 watts in terms of how unlocked or enabled the device is. It could be different. Now that stated, to really fully understand these, you'd have to tap into the battery and measure the actual power exchange there. But realistically, an end user will just set one of these modes or the other. So our solution to this is to test in all relevant modes and then also test battery consumption on all relevant modes and give you both charts separately. Cyberpunk 2077 starts us out. We're using the low preset, running at 1280 by 720 without upscaling, and using these settings on all devices for a like-for-like test. When plugged into the wall and with Turbo active, the ROG Ally is the clear frontrunner in performance, averaging 47% ahead of the deck at 63 FPS. However, its lows are not scaling well with that average. We'll look at Frametimes for that momentarily. In handheld mode with the default performance profile, the Ally's average is slightly behind the deck's at 40 FPS, and the older Aya Neo devices lag behind at 31 FPS for the Next and 23 for the Founder. We confirmed through testing that the Ally is the only one of these devices that significantly alters performance when plugged in. So all of our non-Ally results were logged on battery power. Handheld performance is what really matters though, and starting out at parity with the Steam Deck is bad news for the more expensive Ally. What's even worse for the Ally is the frame time consistency. Holding a 9 FPS 0.1% low when on battery as compared to the deck's 30 FPS lows has the deck clearly advantaged. Let's look at a frame time plot. Here it is. As a reminder, these represent the frame-to-frame interval in milliseconds, or the required time for the system to prepare, render, and flip the frame to the screen. Lower is better, but more consistent is best. The Ally on battery starts with a wide 10 to 20 millisecond frame-to-frame range, but it starts running into big problems as the test advances. We encounter a series of excursions from about 22 to 30 milliseconds all the way up to 100 milliseconds. That's terrible. It's the technical word for it. We're looking for an 8 to 12 millisecond range, but the Ally has a range, or a max minus min, upwards of 90 milliseconds. The Steam Deck, by comparison, is much smoother in frame delivery. The beginning of the test is the smoothest once again, and then deviates more as the test progresses. However, the deck stays within our expected range for the entire test. This is a significant gameplay experience advantage over the Ally, and it shows that average, once again, doesn't tell the whole story. Dying Light 2 is next, with Dying Light 2 manually configured to the low preset, and we manually switched to DX12 with asynchronous compute enabled, and we controlled the settings because the low preset has changed its settings with updates, so we manually set those. The Ally's plugged-in performance was 47 FPS average, 32% ahead of its 36 FPS average on battery power. Trimming the Z1 Extreme's power allowance hurts relative performance in some games more than it does in others. Because of that, we also ran a turbo pass with the Ally actively charging to see whether charging the battery would eat into the APU's power, but the performance difference was minor. Some of the swings in when the power allowance benefits more versus less have to do with which component specifically is consuming that TDP allowance. So, in other words, how much of a CPU or GPU component bind there might be. The Steam Deck averaged 29 FPS in this test, behind the battery-powered results for the Ally, and that's unlike the tied Cyberpunk result. One thing that is consistent, though, is the inconsistency of frame times. The Ally once again suffers as compared to the deck. Here's a frame time plot for Dying Light 2. Once again, the Ally struggles hard. Its first major set of spikes go to 170 milliseconds, so 17% of a second, you're sitting there staring at the same image. The next frame is back down towards 16 milliseconds, then it's back up towards 70 milliseconds. This presents as a stuttery set of images. We then encounter similar spikes around frame 250, 450, and 780. The Ally is inconsistent in its frame time performance. This is traditionally a combination of drivers and power delivery, and the power gating behavior on the Ally may be causing some of this spikiness. The deck, meanwhile, is a much flatter line. There's a single large spike to about 125 milliseconds for the deck, which is visible in gameplay, but the rest of the line remains remarkably and impressively flat. Resident Evil 4 is next. We did most of our testing at low settings, since that's what these handhelds are generally capable of at 720p. For Resident Evil 4, though, we chose the prioritized graphics preset, again without any upscaling. This is another instance where we also double-check the settings manually, and here the battery-powered Ally tied the Steam Deck at 26 FPS and 27 FPS respectively. The plugged-in Ally managed 36 FPS, or 34% ahead of the Steam Deck. The lows are much better in this particular game. Our estimation, again, is that the frame time consistency behavior is probably a mix of game characteristics in terms of the load allocation and of the power gating. Whatever it may be, the end result is observable, and the Ally is tripping over itself in some games, but not others. The good news is that this doesn't appear to be indicative of performance in all scenarios. The Ally did better overall here, although tying a cheaper device still isn't a winning position. We'd have to look at the quality of life features discussed elsewhere in the review to find the value. The frame times for Resident Evil 4 are much better. The Ally is still more variable frame to frame than the deck, but we're not running into the massive stuttery spikes. Red Dead Redemption 2 at 720p is our final game test using the Vulkan API and a favorite performance preset, which again we then fixed those settings to ensure they don't vary. As usual, the Ally's wall power turbo mode was significantly ahead of the handheld performance mode, 55% in this instance. The Ally's performance mode is nearly tied with the deck, and frame times are actually okay on all devices here. Sometimes the Ally on battery power is better than the Steam Deck, but usually it's tied. It's clear that the Ally's maxed out turbo mode puts it far ahead of the Steam Deck in performance, but it's also not practical to run turbo mode without plugging the Ally in, which defeats its purpose. On that subject, let's take a look at the battery life. On all devices, speakers were muted, screen brightness was set to 50%, and screen dimming was disabled. Sleep was also disabled unless otherwise noted. Note also that screen brightness at 50% is not a perfect control, and we want you to be aware of that. To completely control for this, we'd need to take lux measurements and then match the lux. We're looking into this improvement as a possibility for our testing in the future. Device performance settings were left at out-of-the-box defaults, unless otherwise noted. We used our special patent-pending battery life spring tension tester, something we developed in the lab, to run these tests with constant user input. Fortunately, this device is extremely hard for anyone to copy, so we're okay with showing it. Battery life is measured from the beginning of the load to the point where the device automatically shuts down or hibernates. We opted to mostly test at the native resolution of the individual devices. We're not comparing frame rates here, so it doesn't matter. We're seeing how long the batteries last under normal usage conditions. We'll start with the simplest battery life test, looping one of our own 4K 60 videos at full screen and the native desktop version of VLC for each of our devices. Note that full screen in this instance is 1280 by 720 letterbox for the non-Ally devices and 1920 by 1080 for the Ally. The Ally outlasted the deck here by 67% at 216 minutes versus 129. The deck audibly ramped fans and struggled for the duration of the test. Our Aya Neo Next with 5800U and integrated Vega graphics actually outlasted both at 246 minutes, and both the Founder and the Next are equipped with 47 watt-hour batteries to the deck and Ally's 40 watt-hours. Moving to games, we first ran a test with F122 at medium presets with VSync disabled and variable rate shading disabled. This is with the frame rate uncapped, and we'll look at the capped results next. F122 easily exceeds 60 FPS with these settings, so this represents a best case scenario for taking advantage of the Ally's 120Hz display. The power plan was clearly the limiting factor on the Ally. Using the default performance operating mode at both 720p and 1080p, the Ally lasted 100 minutes, while manually bumping the power plan up to turbo at 1080p dropped battery life to 63 minutes. Remember, turbo on battery power has lower power limits than turbo on wall power. 100 minutes in performance mode isn't as bad as it sounds. The Steam Deck, for example, lasted almost exactly as long with VSync disabled. And that lines up with our previous DMC5 testing from the deck's launch. Let's take a moment to consider what those results mean. Using out-of-the-box default settings, the Ally and the Steam Deck are effectively tied in battery life for this test, and they're usually, but not always, tied in terms of FPS under the same conditions, ignoring frame times. This is an underwhelming result for the Ally, but it does have more performance headroom. Next, we ran Dead Cells. This is a 2D game with pixel art, so we ran it at native screen resolution with VSync enabled to represent a common handheld gaming scenario, one which we already tested for the Steam Deck's launch. On the Ally, VSync means 120 Hz unless settings are tweaked, which is likely why the Ally only lasted 167 minutes to the deck's 365, less than half the total playtime. Even with the 60 Hz cap applied, though, the Ally only lasted 207 minutes. If we need to cap the Ally to 60 Hz in order to reach half the deck's battery life, it defeats a lot of the purpose of having that 120 Hz panel, other than other differences like resolution. Time to talk charge time. The Ally was the fastest of the handhelds to recharge from 0%. With the system turned off and charging for a full cycle, peak power draw was 53 watts, which dropped sharply after 30 minutes to about 30 watts, then gradually fell until the charge cycle completed at about 98 minutes. In comparison, the Steam Deck took 168 minutes to charge, despite having the same nominal battery capacity. There are 2 points we'd like to make here. First, plugging in a higher wattage adapter doesn't always make these devices just charge faster. With the systems off and doing nothing except charging, none of them hit the max capacity of their chargers, 45 watts for the deck and 65 for the others. The Ally's adapter has little headroom for charging and gaming at the same time. A Steam Deck can run games at full performance while charging, whereas gaming without charging already maxes out the Ally's charger. We didn't see any significant performance degradation from gaming while charging on the Ally, but it may extend charging time, of course. Let's look at thermals and fan behavior by proxy of looking at the thermals. This is done first with F122 as a gaming load, and then we'll look at Blender. In this chart, you're seeing the torture scenario on the Ally. It's plugged in, running turbo mode, and it's at 100% screen brightness, so this is about a worst case scenario for it. That hard ramp to about 96 degrees Celsius that you're seeing is when it's waiting for the fans to respond. ASUS has stated it went with a less aggressive fan curve to try and temper the noise, something that it talked about publicly closer to its launch. And that's evident here. We think that they should probably kick the fans into higher speeds sooner in this curve, though. The high temperature is from a delayed start on those fans ramping to the higher speeds, which eventually do bring up the RPM, and that brings the temperature to more reasonable levels. The occasional spikes are during loading screens where the fan behavior oscillates. Here's the chart at steady state. The hottest set of tests we have at steady state, once we're past the initial fan ramp where the APU is hitting TJ max, would be the torture workload, hitting between 75 and 77 degrees Celsius on the APU and SoC components. And the drive here was in the 60s, which is okay. This test was with the screen maxed at 100% and the charger plugged in, so once again a worst case. Unplugging the charger drops turbo mode's power consumption, so it's no longer a pure like for like, but the end result is similar. We're at about 73 to 75 degrees Celsius. Adjusting only the brightness drops that by another few degrees Celsius. And remember that changing the modes like performance and turbo, or changing whether it's plugged in, will possibly affect the fan speed depending on the configuration, which affects the temperature too, not just the power. Screen brightness here definitely has an impact on thermals, but that makes sense. So you can touch the screen and feel the difference. It runs pretty hot, as most screens do. Going to performance mode drops a massive 15 degrees or so from the turbo 50% brightness result at 71.7 to 56.9 degrees Celsius. That's a crazy drop, and it aligns with the power reduction that performance claims. Moving to silent mode drops even further, around another 10 degrees, depending on which metric you look at. And we've got acoustics separately for all these modes as well, of course. Thermally, only the brief slams against the 96 degrees Celsius wall are concerning, but those appear to only briefly pop up while waiting for the fans to really kick into gear. ASUS could adjust the hysteresis here, or effectively a fan curve, to tackle this, and this could be done via BIOS, so they could change it at any time if they wanted to. Ultimately, though, the temperature came back down rapidly, and it didn't stay elevated in a way that would concern us about the CPU and GPU components. Now, the SD card, however, is a separate matter. We'll get to that later. With a CPU torture workload using Blender, so nearly 0% GPU and 100% CPU, we can even more clearly see the fan behavior reflected in the thermals. The CPU T-die reading was 95 degrees Celsius for nearly 3.5 minutes. That's far too slow of a fan ramp here, because you're already losing clocks in that time. ASUS needs to rework the hysteresis, we think. It's going to get loud anyway, but throttling for several minutes before getting loud, or if not throttling, just running this hot, it's really not a good trade-off. You can just accept a little more noise. They also cool it to a temperature that, at least for the APU, is unnecessary anyway. ASUS could meet in the middle. They could improve both the initial load thermals and the steady-state noise levels while maintaining an acceptable combination of both. It's possible that some other component needs the fan aggression, though. Without probing everything on the board, we can't be certain if that's the case. In order to test the MicroSD thermal problem that's been so widely discussed, we first needed to get a MicroSD card detected in the Ally, which proved a lot more difficult than we thought it would be. We tried a SanDisk Extreme Plus 128GB, a SanDisk Extreme 512GB, a PNY Premier X256, and a Samsung Pro Plus 256. We bought a couple different brands. All of these are completely functional cards that show up on other devices, as well as the Ally itself if connected through a USB card reader. We formatted as exFAT, we tried NTFS as recommended by the official ASUS guide, we tried FAT32, and we tried disabling and re-enabling the SD card reader in BIOS and Device Manager. We also tried downloading and installing every possible driver, software, and firmware update from the ASUS website, as well as Windows Update, MyASUS, and Armory Crate. We tried booting into the built-in MyASUS in WinRe diagnostic tool, which has tests for pretty much everything except for the SD card reader. And we tried running a system repair. So all of that wasn't to test the problem. That was to try and get an SD card working in the device at all, a MicroSD in the top here. And because we couldn't get one working, we think we've come to the conclusion that our device has already been a victim of the MicroSD card problem. Much of the secondary and user reporting has focused on the SD cards themselves. But upon reviewing ASUS's official statement, which it posted on Discord, the wording was, quote, "Under certain thermal stress conditions, the SD card reader may malfunction." They also said, quote, "If you are currently experiencing issues with your SD card reader." Well, our SD card reader is malfunctioning, and it has been since basically we got it. We had thermocouples wired to the microSD card reader internally and to some of the other chips around it, but we never were able to make use of any of that because since we can't get a card to reliably detect, to generate any kind of load to thermally stress it, like transferring files, they were useless. It's effectively The reader itself appears to be more or less dead on our device. One thing we were wondering is whether this is an issue with the Genesis Logic GL9755 SD card reader controller in general, not just thermals. Either way, we have confirmed that there is a problem. We just never got to test what may be causing it. Patrick even checked under a microscope for visible damage to the SD card controller, the SD card reader, and we can't see any. Now, to get any further here, we'd have to send it out to an external lab for failure analysis, which we might not do. We'll see if it's worth it or not. But what we can confirm is that, yes, this is a problem because the microSD card reader issue did occur for us. ASUS has acknowledged it as well. So we know it's a real thing. We just don't know what triggered it precisely. So in theory, ASUS says some of its updates, like the BIOS, should prevent the SD card reader from malfunctioning. It's very hard to prove a negative because we'd be trying to prove the it no longer fails aspect of it. But to do any further testing, we would need to buy another Ally, install the updates, and then use it, and at some point draw a line and say, okay, it's probably fixed. So for now, what we can say is the issue did happen, and ASUS has said that it's been working on addressing it via its updates, but we basically just have to all look at the community to see if more of these types of failures pop up. So wrapping up, we're not going to recap every single section here in the conclusion. We're going to focus on more broad, wide-sweeping stuff. So if you've jumped here and you're looking for microSD card or noise or thermal, any of that, you're going to have to go back for those specific things. Now at launch, the Z1 Extreme was the most powerful mainstream handheld gaming PC, and there is always a market for most powerful thing in a category because you're not really fighting on value as much. Now the market is already shaping just a little over a month or 2 months later at this point, and GPD is shipping Win 4 2023s, and Aya Neo has announced its Quint, which both of these devices will compete very directly with the Ally. Handhelds obviously need a mix of being cool, quiet, and really a more important way than, say, a laptop sometimes, and they run on tiny batteries, so battery life matters. In this way, being the most powerful thing is maybe not as important as it would be for a desktop GPU, because there's a lot more downsides to it. Now, it's possible to cap the Ally's refresh rate and its power draw, but at that point, it starts to make sense to maybe buy a cheaper device that is built around those characteristics instead. And the Steam Deck is super competitive right now because they just introduced the refurb program where you get them even cheaper if you're okay with something that's got maybe some wear and tear to it. At this point, the Ally non-extreme Z1 at $600, without having tested it, of course, we don't think is worth considering because there's simply too many alternatives. We can look at the on-paper specs versus, say, this one, the Ally, and the Steam Decks, and we could draw that conclusion without needing it in hand to do so, knowing everything we know about this device and its competitors. So the specs for the non-extreme are massively decreased, and it's beyond what a 14% discount really justifies. Now, this Ally is definitely still ahead of the Steam Deck specs-wise, but the deck competes based on value, not just horsepower. The cheapest deck is $400. It can be upgraded to double the Ally's storage capacity for maybe another $100, and $700 for an ASUS handheld is impressively low, actually, given ASUS's general value of its brand. But Valve's got a secret advantage, which is that it owns the damn store you're buying the games from, and it can, and probably has, sold hardware at a loss. On top of that, looking back at some of our gaming charts, the Ally's performance advantage becomes much smaller when running on battery power. If you want a handheld PC and intend to use it that way, not just plug it in, the deck is the better price to performance option, but the Ally has more headroom to scale that performance up. The Ally does have one at least clear advantage to us, which is the quality of the screen, where regardless of what you think of the refresh rate, 120 Hertz, whether it's useful or not, the actual image quality that you get is better, we think, on the Ally than on the deck. If that matters to you, maybe that swings it the other way. But for now, that's it for the testing of this device, and we hope you enjoyed the review. It was a massive amount of work, and we really enjoyed working on it, so we're looking forward to doing more of these. We will get these a little bit shorter as we continue to iterate on the process, but for now, this gives you at least the sort of foundation for what we have coming up. The GPD Win 4 is likely to be the next one, if you didn't catch on. But we've got some others we're looking at too. Thanks for watching. Please support us if you like this content and or found it useful. because we need your help to be able to continue paying for the extremely long production times on stuff like this. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to grab a useful item like one of our soldering or project mats, our mod mats, our shirts if you want something simpler, and our toolkits are there as well. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.